Hello, and welcome back to Comparative Vertebrate Anatomy. Today we want to talk about the nervous system. And the nervous system is your control center. And when you talk about the nervous system, you are talking about a billions of nerve cells, and they're all linked together in this organized form that allows for all of the things that you do. And so it's this kind of almost instantaneous, obviously it's not instantaneous because there's reflex time, things like that, but you have this really rapid control of everything that you're doing. And so there are three basic functions that we want to talk about in terms of the nervous system. The first one is sensation, and this is your sensing of the outside world. And so you receive a stimulus, right? And that's something from the outside world. And then you have receptor cells all over your body. And we're going to focus on photoreceptors because we'll be dissecting an eye. But there are all kinds of receptors. There are mechanoreceptors that feel pressure on your skin. You have the cells in your ears that are auditory receptors. You have taste buds that do gustation, which is tasting. You can smell, right? The olfactory bulb is the collection of all of your smell sensors. Now, integration. It's not enough to just get this information. You have to put it together. You have to put it in some sort of organized form, and that is what your brain does. Now, there are different ways of responding to things. You can have an reflex reaction, something that is just automatic, or you can actually think about your reaction. And so your brain is very complex, and in different situations, different parts of it will respond in different ways, okay? And that is the third part, is the reaction. This is the motor output. This is the activation of muscles or glands, whatever. Usually this is because there are neurotransmitters, which are chemicals that are released that will trigger whatever the response is, and that's the motor output, okay? Now, the nervous system is divided into two systems, right? You've got the central nervous system, the CNS, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And this is really the integration center. This is the control center, right? And then the other one is the PNS, peripheral nervous system. We'll talk about that in a minute, okay? So what are we talking about here? It's very simple. It is the brain and the spinal cord, okay? And now this picture shows the CNS here, and then all of the nerves that go off. Those are the peripheral nerve. That's the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so let's start with your brain. One of the things that makes us so different from all of the other animals, because you'll notice it's us that we are the ones who are controlling everything. We're the ones who are, driving cars. As I always like to say, bears don't drive to work, and so we have this amazing cerebral cortex, and this is what allows us to have all of that advanced thought process that separates us from the rest of the animals. Now, there are four regions of the cerebral cortex that we want to talk about, and it's the frontal lobe, which is the reasoning, planning, right? Complex movements. Part of the speech, your speech actually comes from several parts of your brain, but its frontal lobe is involved. Emotions and problem solving, okay? And so this is, kind of like the heart of you. Your parietal lobe is about movement and orientation, so it's going to help you with your balance where you are, helps perceive some of the stimuli. It's receiving those stimuli from, like the messages from the stimulus that you get. A stimulus is singular, stimuli is plural. And then the temporal lobe is about perception and hearing and memory. And then here's also involved in speech, and then also comprehension, understanding things. And then your occipital lobe is entirely about vision, okay? And so it's interesting because injury back here, right, actually affects whether you can see or not. And that's kind of an interesting thing. Okay, the limbic system. This is common to all mammals. You have the thalamus, which is going to relay the information between the PNS to the brain, okay? And so this is kind of like that highway that sends those messages to where they need to be processed. The hypothalamus is going to maintain homeostasis. It's going to control all of those those things that will help you maintain homeostasis, like thirst and hunger. It's going to tell you when to be sleepy and when to be awake. It controls the autonomic nervous system, which we'll talk about in just a minute. The other thing too is that you have some of your base emotions here. And chimpanzees have this as well, so one of our closest relatives. But they don't have the well-developed cerebral cortex. And so in order to control emotions, you have to have both the cerebral cortex and the thalamus. You can have emotions without the cerebral cortex, but you lose things like impulse control. The amygdala is where your flight or fight response is coming from. This is also about memory, emotion, and then fear. This is where your fear reaction comes from. The hippocampus is part of that learning, memory. This is where you actually convert whatever's coming in short term, because everything first comes in short term, and you have to commit that to long-term memory, that permanent memory. If your hippocampus is damaged, then you won't be in certain ways, you won't be able to remember things long term. This is also spatial relationships. How are things oriented around you? All right, and midbrain. Midbrain is also called your reptilian brain, and it's vision, hearing, eye movement, body movement. This is all your voluntary motor function. The pons, which is right below the inferior to the midbrain, is about motor control, sensory analysis, movement, posture. And you'll notice that you'll see things repeatedly because your brain is integrated and different parts talk together and work together to interpret these signals and respond to them appropriately. So you'll see things over and over and over again. Each part does something a little bit different. And then the medulla, which is inferior to the pons, and this is breathing, heart rate, all of these vital body functions that you don't have to think about. Okay, now, vascularization, right? Your brain has lots and lots and lots of blood vessels, okay? And so you need a lot of blood. And actually about 20% of the energy that you take in goes to your brain, right? And so really, really huge amounts of nutrients, oxygen, all of that stuff has to go to your brain. And that's what your carotids are doing. They go up into the brain. And when we were talking about it was like, oh, that goes into your head. And so it might be easy to think, oh, that goes into your face, but it doesn't. It goes to your brain. The brachiocephalic, that branches into the brachial and the cephalic. It's the cephalic that goes to the rest of your head. Okay, so spinal cord, right? The spinal cord are layers of meninges, okay? And so there are these nerves that run all the way up the length. So the nerve comes out, and so it goes to wherever your body into wherever your body it's going to go. And then they are rooted in this spinal cord, okay? And your spinal cord in the center has gray matter. Your brain has gray matter and white matter, and your spine has gray matter running at the center. And so this is kind of like the main channel. It's not kind of like it is. The main channel from your peripheral nervous system all the way up to your brain. Okay, now PNS, and by the way, we're just doing a quick overview, right? PNS, the peripheral nervous system, these are all the nerves. The major things are 31 spinal nerves and 12 cranial nerves, and I've got some of the major nerves on this picture right here. And then here is a picture of the cranial nerves and what they do, actually, because you can see that they go to different parts, right? Like the vagus nerve goes to the digestive system, and, you know, and you can read that. Okay, now let's talk about the peripheral nervous system in terms of what it does. It is responsible for the communication between the central nervous system and the rest of the body, and it's actually divided into two major divisions, the sensory division and the motor division, right? So it's sensory afferent division and the motor efferent division. And so remember, afferent means away, right? We've seen afferent before. We were talking about, oh, the afferents carry the blood to the body and all this good stuff, depending on where you're talking about. So afferent comes up quite a lot, actually. So this is what's going to conduct impulses from the receptor to the nervous system, the central nervous system. And so this is like the lookout. Okay, so you're sensing everything around you. That motor efferent division is going to respond to that, and it's going to do that through motor nerve fibers, and it'll trigger whatever response you're going to have. And again, we're going to talk about the eye today, or we're going to dissect an eye. And so one of the reasons that I selected an eye over anything else is they're interesting, but two, we're diurnal. And so vision plays a huge role in our understanding of the world. We sense mostly through our eyes. We don't hear as well as other animals. We don't smell as well as other animals. We don't taste as well as other animals. And so the rest of our senses are not particularly great comparatively, but we see very well. And it's very complex. And so this is the inside of the eye, and you'll be looking at this. Here's the lens, and so we're going to cut this in half. There's the iris, right? And then the pupil, of course, is the opening, the cornea across the top here. And then the other thing that I want to point out just right now, there's two things actually, is the retina and the optic nerve. The optic nerve is the nerve that's going to go back into the brain, right, to say, oh, this is what's going on here. And then the retina is made up of all of these cells, okay? So you've got rod and cone cells. So these are the rod cells and these are the cone cells. And the cone cells come in blue, red, and green, and they sense color. And then the cones sense light and dark. And so the combination of the cells being stimulated, how much they're stimulated, which ones, where, that sort of thing, is what gives you the picture. It's what allows your brain to interpret a picture. And this is an actual picture, right? These are the rods and these are cones. And so I think that's really cool, right? And these are the basal cells. Really, really neat stuff, actually. So that's real. That's what it really looks like. Okay. Now, the motor division can be divided into two sections as well. Your voluntary and your involuntary. So that's somatic is voluntary, autonomic is involuntary, and they are just what they sound like. Somatic nerve fibers send impulses to the skeletal muscles so you can move them. And so this is all about your movements that you're doing intentionally. Involuntary is going to go to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Okay, so like your digestive system, your heart, your diaphragm, your salivary glands, whatever, all of those things. And those are things you don't have to think about. Your body just does it. It's automatic, right? Please remember that's autonomic nervous system, not automatic nervous system. That gets confusing for people sometimes. Autonomic is involuntary, somatic is voluntary. Okay, now dividing more, your autonomic nervous system has two settings as well. There's the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight portion of that response. And then you also have what's cutely called the rest and digest phase. Okay. And so these two systems are antagonistic, and so they have to be balanced in order to keep a state of equilibrium. Right? So the sympathetic nervous system, like I said, is the fight or flight, and the trigger for this is adrenaline and noradrenaline. And so here are some of the things that adrenaline and noradrenaline do, right? And so you can see what's responsible for it and then what happens. So adrenaline, for instance, will trigger a response in the eye to dilate the pupil. Okay, in the heart, it'll increase the heart rate. Blood pressure is going to increase. Okay, and the reason that that's important is because you need more blood to the skeletal muscles, right? So you can actually respond to whatever's going on. And it's going to inhibit digestive functions, so you can focus on whatever this response is. And then, of course, there's some other things going on as well. Check those out. Okay, now the parasympathetic is the rest and digest. This is where you are conserving and maintaining energy, okay? And so you'll notice these are all much more relaxed activities. Okay, so your heart rate's gonna go lower, it's gonna bring your breathing rate down, your blood pressure down, okay? And so you have that relaxation. So fight or flight is that big stress, tension reaction. Parasympathetic is the relaxation. And this is just a table to show you kind of what the differences are in some of the main responses. And here is a flowchart so you can see how the divisions are. So your somatic and autonomic sensory receptors and neurons, they're all processed by the brain and spinal cord. So this is the sensory peripheral nervous system. And then the responses are sent through the motor peripheral nervous system, and that was the somatic, which is voluntary, that goes to skeletal muscle. Autonomic, right, which is involuntary, having both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, goes to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, and adipose tissue, right? Adipose tissue would be fatty tissue. Okay, Now, nervous tissue has really two major cell types, neurons, and these are the conducting cells. They conduct signals back and forth. Well, each nerve is like one way, but there are nerves in one direction, nerves in the other direction. And you have the neuroglia, which are the supporting cells. They're the ones that are going to make sure that everything is where it needs to be. They'll do any of the other signaling, and they play a different role that we're not going to get into too much. Okay? Neurons are actually really cool. They're the largest cells in your body. They have the cell body like every other cell, and then they have the soma here, right? But then surrounding all of that, they have all of these cool, like feely things, right? These branches that are gonna be connected to other branches, and so they can get lots of information to and from lots of different places. And so the dendrites are going to be the input region, and then that signal is going to be conducted down the axon, and then it'll go out the axon terminal, and this is the output. So this may be connected to another nerve cell, you know, something, it may trigger a neurotransmitter, whatever. But these are really cool cells. Okay, and then neurons can conduct information in two ways, from one end of a neuron to the other end of the neuron, and this is about an action potential, which is electrochemistry kind of thing, and then across the space, right, separating one neuron from another, and that's usually done with neurotransmitters. Okay, all right. Now, what are some of the problems in the nervous system? Concussion. This is where you hit the brain and you have a temporary, what's called a temporary disturbance. So, you know, and you guys probably know quite a lot about concussion since we have concussion management programs. All right, now, paralysis is the loss of sensation or movement in any part of the body due to a spinal cord or brain injury. And I've liked this picture because it shows you, here's the spinal cord and the brain. Anything from any damage from here down, and it's paraplegic. Anywhere from here down, and you're going to go from diaphragm down. Anywhere from here down, and it's going to be quadriplegic, but still having neck movements, and then here down, it's really head only, is not paralyzed. Okay, and then Parkinson's disease, this is where you don't produce enough dopamine, and so the brain doesn't transmit properly, and so you get tremors, and your muscles tense up, and you can't walk very well, and your face doesn't respond to things, and it's, you know, a debilitating disease. And then there's Alzheimer's, where the neurons are actually shrinking, and so the brain is no longer capable of performing its functions, and so that's going to lead to memory loss, inappropriate emotional responses, inability to function, that kind of like childlike behavior, and eventually it leads to death. All right, and then epilepsy is where you have the brain sending messages that aren't real, right? And so you have this, what's called a misfire of the neurons, and that results in seizures. Okay, and then evolutionary advances in the nervous system, really cool. The human nervous system is very, very complex, and vertebrates have nervous systems that are more complex than anything else because there's the brain and then the spinal cord and nerves. But once you get to birds and mammals, it's much more complex. And then by the time you get to mammals, specifically humans, it's really complex. So what are the big things? First of all, you have this central organizing system that receives the information, organizes it, and then responds. Nerve cells are completely specialized, like all the cells in your body, but you have these specialized conducting cells. And then the brain is actually organized into various control centers. And so there's a division of labor, if you will, within the brain itself. And then the central nervous system is actually connected to the body by way of these feelers, right? These peripheral nerves. And then we have really complex sense organs that are able to sense the environment, regardless if you're talking about a human who does not smell well or hear well, you know, comparatively. We're still very complex. All of the vertebrates have complex sense organs. Okay, that's it for this conversation. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will see you next time when we are dissecting an eye.